Donell, welcome. In previous years, we have seen the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, prioritize what they call homegrown violent extremists, such as supporters of terrorist organizations like ISIS, domestic violent extremists to include white supremacists, and lone actors be the priority. Are these threats still being closely monitored?
Well, a lot depends on what you mean by closely monitored. They're being monitored, but my sources have told me within the intelligence community that the focus is shifted from a lot of these threat actors, these domestic threat actors, to immigration enforcement. And so we're seeing the same amount of resources that we saw in 2020, 2022, being split between the domestic threat that you articulated and this kind of newly articulated threat, which is the migrant threat.
Where are you seeing shifts, reductions, or full out closures of department agencies that would have been monitoring these groups?
I'm not sure if we have enough time for all of them, but
Which is in itself a bit
a
unsettling
commentary.
to hear.
Correct. I will tell you that in my many conversations with individuals that are actively doing this work today, you've seen cuts specifically in the FBI in their ability to monitor these threats. We've seen a degradation of funding, and then we've seen the resources, the human resources, the analytical resources being split.
So you're talking about the National Security Division of the Bureau, and within that, the counterintelligence analysts. Is that right?
That's correct. Well, not just that, but the JTTF, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which has been lauded for the last 2 decades, right, post 9/11, as individuals that are coalesce around a singular mission to detect and identify and interdict a domestic and foreign terrorist threat. Those individuals are out there doing ICE raids right now. I know some of them personally, and they're not at their desks, they're not with their analysts, and they're not looking for that domestic threat as we just discussed.
What are some other places where you're seeing major shifts?
Well, in DHS, we're seeing shifts, specifically in their analytical assessments and what they're tracking, DHS INA, in
The
Intelligence
Intelligence
and
and Analysis
Analysis
Office.
Office. What they were looking at a year ago this time, they're not looking at as much. And so, it becomes an issue when you widen or expand an agency or an office's mission and their scope without doing so with the resources that they need.
Where are you seeing these analysts having to focus their time if it's not on the traditional domestic extremist terrorist threat?
Well, initially my fear was that they would be looking at a different domestic terrorism threat. So the current administration has stated explicitly that they wanted to look at left-wing radicals and left-wing extremists, and not look at the right-wing extremists. But that fear hasn't materialized. What they're actually looking at is the transnational criminal organizations, the TDAs, the Tren de Aguas, the MS-13s, their movement within their human trafficking, which is important. So what they're not looking at are the traditional threats that we were analyzing for when I was a Homeland Security chief here, which is KSTs, known as suspected terrorists. Foreign nationals are coming here as sleeper cells. Our domestic threats, homegrown and influenced by, ISIS or Al Qaeda, and once again, their attention span has been split. What we've been tracking and what we've been kind of hitting the bell or the alarm on for at least the last decade is violent right-wing extremists, neo-Nazis, right? Groups like that.
I think it's important to explain why right wing extremism is where the focus has been, because there are left wing extremists.
Absolutely. So if you look at the trend over the last 2 decades, starting in the early 2000s, we had a lot of left-leaning extremist groups particularly environmental groups, pro-animal groups, that were committing acts of violence. You can call them domestic terrorist acts. We saw that kind of taper down. And in the mid-2000s, we saw the rise of the violent right extremists. Now, they have always been there. What concerned us about those groups is their lethality, their propensity to have weapons and to know how to use those weapons. So we can trace these organizations, their DNA, back to incidents that are pivotal in the right-wing extremist movement, such as Ruby Ridge, right? Such as Waco, Timothy McVeigh, who was influenced by that, and he was the Oklahoma City bomber. Eric Rudolph, who was the Atlanta Olympic bomber. And so we've always been, really focused on that tranche of domestic extremists and never really looked at the left because they weren't necessarily as violent and they didn't have the tactics, techniques, and procedures and the organization that some of the individuals and the groups on the right had.
And unfortunately, that has also led to accusations of partisanship.
Absolutely. And that really bubbled over with January 6th, right? So January 6th in and of itself is a divisive issue. The vast majority of the country, if you had looked at polls immediately post January 6th, blamed right-wing extremists, blamed people on the right side of the political spectrum. And now 4 or 5 years later, it's completely flipped. These individuals are exonerated. They're patriots. They were doing the right thing. But it's now those on the left that we have to track down. Many violent extremists on the left, and there are them, obviously, we track all of them. They've fallen into this trap with the recent attacks on Teslas and Tesla dealerships. And so they've really fed into that narrative that the left is violent, and they're more of a concern, a national security and a homeland security concern.
So, what happens if the FBI and Homeland Security are taking resources away from the previously stated priorities of looking at domestic violent extremists, people in the United States who support ISIS? Are we essentially putting ourselves in a September 10th situation?
We are, but I do want to take a step back. Every administration has an opportunity to reset their own homeland security and intelligence priorities. Often those priorities are not politically motivated. Those priorities are established through the intelligence community and leadership in the intelligence community from the NSA, the FBI, the ODNI. What we've seen is a wholesale removal of a lot of that leadership, and we can talk about that later, that helps to establish those priorities. And those priorities have been replaced with, I think, a political priority. And I'm not making a value judgment about the impact of illegal immigration. But I think that from a strict intelligence and homeland security standpoint, the impact of illegal immigration has been conflated into a threat. If you or I were analysts in any shop, we would not articulate as a threat. And they've linked that to these violent gangs. And that's what's driving, I think, our current posture.
Well, for people who still have jobs in the national security space, or say the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, what are they being asked to do now versus before?
They're being asked to do so much more with so much less. And that's an exact quote that I've gotten from someone in the last week on the JTTF. They're being asked to support DHS in a way they've never done before. And a caveat that one of the things that the current administration has done successfully has been able to integrate operationally DHS operational components and DOJ operational components. Heretofore, we really never saw en masse these operational entities, DHS ICE, DHS Customs and Border Protection, FBI, really collaborate on a normal day-to-day operational level. But while they're doing that, they're also not looking at their caseloads for known as suspected terrorists, people who are being called in, right? We tell the public, if you see something, say something. If a family member or someone in the community is worried that someone may be radicalized by ISIS, those cases are piling up. That is confirmed. The other thing is that these individuals, particularly on the DOJ side, when they're looking to get warrants, they have to go to a U.S. attorney. There's been a wholesale exodus of U.S. attorneys. And so I'm being told that their caseloads are backed up because they can't even get in front of a U.S. attorney to get a sign off on a warrant. And so these things are really having a knock-on effect on our whole ecosystem in terms of our environment.
What is the implication of that?
Well, let's say I'm an FBI agent and I got a tip from somebody saying, we suspect this person is doing something illegal. I can go and knock on the door. I can have a consensual conversation. But in order for me to maybe get a warrant to interrogate their electronic devices, to perform a wiretap, in order to go and search their home or their vehicle, I need a warrant. And so I have to present my case to a U.S. attorney within my district. There are very few U.S. attorneys that are available now to these individuals to do that. And so I'm hearing of cases that are months old, literally months old, waiting for a U.S. attorney to hear this case so they can sign off on a warrant so that that further investigation, that further surveillance if needed can be done.
And these are what kinds of cases?
They're mostly counterterrorism cases, domestic terrorism cases.
You'd also told me in a previous conversation that some people who work in these joint terrorism task forces are now being asked to go out on ICE raids, which is highly unusual. Talk about that.
Yeah, you don't have to take my word for it. You can go to any of your social media platforms. You can go to YouTube and you can see a team of individuals going to arrest or arresting an individual or a group of individuals with various agencies. And you'll see DHS, you'll see ICE, you'll see CBP, you'll also see FBI, because there is such a shortage of law enforcement to execute these immigration warrants and to conduct these raids, that they're looking towards not only FBI, but ATF and other DOJ operational components to support them in this mission. This is not traditionally an FBI mission. Some of these raids can take 7 or 8 hours. It's a whole shift out of their day. Their work is still waiting for them. Their work is not this type of work.
What does that ultimately mean? Are there people who need to be investigated who are walking down the street presenting a national security threat, going unchecked?
What it means is that if you're a domestic terrorist, or would-be domestic terrorist, or transnational terrorist, this is a ripe time for you to plan and execute an attack. Because the individuals that we have watching, alerting, analyzing for these threats have their attention span scattered throughout the entire spectrum of threats. And so it is a concern.
I also remember you saying in a previous conversation with me, I don't think since 9/11 we've seen a shifting of domestic security toward a singular mission space.
So we're vulnerable like we were on September 10th, 2001. On that day, we had two agencies, the CIA and the FBI, that were doing their jobs, but doing it independently and not really collaborating well, which is why we got 9/11. That's not my opinion, that's fact. Now we have dozens, if not hundreds of agencies that are doing similarly. And what we haven't talked about is the knock-on effect. We've really focused on this conversation so far on the federal government. But as the federal government goes, the state and locals also go. And there are linked agencies at the state and local level to their federal counterparts. And as the federal government shifts their focus, believe me that the state and locals are also shifting their focus, which really comprises the entire ecosystem. And so while on September 11th, September 12th, we took our eye away from the domestic threat and we said, let's protect ourselves from them over there. The same thing is happening here in this day and age.
You have also talked about fusion centers and the lack of staff, resources, how they often find themselves focused on immediate crimes rather than larger problems of domestic extremism. How does that ultimately open the door for extremist groups?
Fusion centers, which are essentially state and local fusion intelligence centers that bring together federal assets, state and local assets, including surveillance, intelligence collection and analysis to help the state and locals so we don't have another 9/11, they're going to suffer greatly in this administration. And that's not my opinion, that's just fact. The federal government and the IC will survive. They will find a way. The state and locals are a lot more in a tenuous position because they are wholly supported by federal grant dollars. Many of these federal grant dollars, such as the UASI, Urban Area Security Initiative, which are DHS grant dollars, we've seen those being clawed back or completely eliminated. There are fusion centers like the one I had in DC that are 100% grant funded by the federal government. If those grants cease to exist, these state and locals cannot maintain the infrastructure needed to collect and analyze and synthesize federally supported intelligence and information and make that relevant and contextualize that for the state and locals. And so they're really at a disadvantage because they don't have the largesse, they don't have the resources. There are some fusion centers, I'm not going to mention the states, they have 3 or 4 analysts for the entire state. And so they have to worry about transnational threats, they have to worry about transnational crime, trafficking, human trafficking, drug trafficking, and domestic extremism with 4 intelligence analysts. It's simply not possible.
Absolutely insurmountable as you're describing it. So essentially, what we've talked about with the federal government and how the shift is changing and the focus is moving away from terrorist organizations, extremist groups, the lone actors who are going to come forward in tragedies ahead, that we're seeing essentially the same thing on a smaller scale with these local fusion centers.
Absolutely. And know that the lone actor is probably our most difficult threat to detect and interdict. And when the lone actor is detected and interdicted, it happens at the state and local level. They're the ones who are picking up that call. It's not a 911 call necessarily. It's if you see something, say something call, which goes to the fusion center. It goes to the state police. Hey, I saw this guy posting something with guns and said they're going to go and do X, Y, and Z. That's not necessarily going to the FBI. That's being triaged at the state and local level. That capacity needs to stay there. And so it's so difficult to stop that lone actor, especially when they don't leave the breadcrumbs, right? That we conventionally talk about. They don't have that leakage that we talk about in our business. This really blows the door off. It's almost like we're giving up on doing that now. We're just going to accept the fact that there's a level of threat that we have to accept so that we can track down transnational criminal organizations, which are now designated as foreign terrorist organizations, to get them out of our country.
Let's talk about analysis. Let's talk about intelligence and evidence. There was a 60 Minutes investigation that found that 238 Venezuelan migrants who were deported to El Salvador, about 75% of them had no apparent criminal record. The US government has called them terrorists and gangsters, but they have not provided any evidence, any analysis or intelligence to the public.
It is incredibly labor intensive to collect and analyze information on an individual and a group. It requires legal sign off often. It requires analysis. It requires sometimes confidential informants. There is a lot that goes in, and these are years-long investigations often, unless there's an immediate threat to life and safety, which we can, they can shut down. Otherwise, to get into these organizations and collect the information that's necessary to start with criminal proceedings, it can take years. I mean, you've heard stories about Hell's Angels, right? And operatives being embedded in these groups for years. And so how could they possibly have enough intelligence or information that would stand in a court of law under cross-examination? And so it doesn't surprise me that we have a lot of people that are being deported that clearly have no connection.
You had also talked about a massive deportation effort that you believe is in the works. The U.S. intelligence community has assessed that Venezuela's government is likely not directing Tren de Aragua in the United States. And that is an assertion that the president has used to invoke the Alien Enemies Act in order to remove undocumented immigrants.
Yeah, so that's a problem. That's a problem legally for their justification. We're currently in this space that these individuals aren't really being given their day in court.
Does this intelligence assessment ultimately put the intelligence community at odds with Trump?
It already has. Two of the high-ranking members of the National Intelligence Council were sacked. We've also seen moves by the DNI,
The director of national
the Director
intelligence.
of National Intelligence, to bring that analytical capability that's housed in the CIA for the presidential daily briefing into her organization. And so, from individuals that I'm hearing, there's a pressure on them to produce intelligence and analysis that is going to be well received, and not intelligence and analysis that is accurate and factual.
When we think about intelligence, we often don't think about open source intelligence, which is information that can be found in the public sphere. How does that play a role in this conversation?
It's playing an outside role. I mean, if we had had this conversation in October, November last year, I would say that open source intelligence is there. There's technology, especially social media monitoring, that's advancing our ability to do more monitoring and collection with less individuals. But now that's being used at border crossings for individuals coming to visit this country.
Is that a bad thing? This
Um,
administration would say that's a way of protecting the homeland.
I think that there's two different ways to look at it. And so certainly if you're a US citizen or green card holder and legally here, it gives you pause about what you post on social media, what you like even. The other thing that it causes is, to what extent are we going to be using social media to determine whether someone's committed a crime or may commit a crime in the future? And people like us in the industry, we always talk about Minority Report, that very famous movie that came out in the mid 2000s. Those tools are available to individuals, and they can be used, a dual use technology. They can be used for good and they can be used for evil. And so that's concerning. The last thing I'll say is the guardrails for protecting civil rights and civil liberties have been removed.
Yeah, let's talk about the office. Well, there are several offices inside the Department of Homeland Security that are meant to uh, essentially be a check here, that are focused on privacy.
So we have the CRCL office, which is
Oh
Civil
my
Rights,
God, I
Civil
love
Liberty.
all of these
Yeah, the Civil Rights and
freaking
Civil Liberties
acronyms.
Office.
All right, so let's
Um,
say it one more time for everybody.
so we have the CRCL, or Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Office of DHS. It's a very small office, I think less than 200 people, very pivotal office. My personal feeling, and the feelings of many individuals who I know in DHS, is that it fell victim to this kind of anti-DEI kind of shift because of its name. But it does so much more than its name. Our intelligence analysts at the state and local level, at the fusion centers, they get direction from the CRCL. My privacy officer, which was my officer that cleared every single intelligence product that left my office to make sure that we weren't violating anyone's civil rights, was trained by the CRCL. And so when that goes away and you have a complaint about DHS, and we've seen high profile complaints, CBP officers fondling young children, all the way to domestic spying, when that goes away, everyone should be concerned. We have in this country the potential to have the second largest domestic spying enterprise in the world, only behind China. And all we have to do is turn the switch on. And if we don't have analysts and caseworkers and individuals in power that have civil rights and civil liberties in the forefront of their mind, then domestic spying will occur. I believe it already is occurring, and it has occurred, but it will go on unchecked.
Okay, what's the status of the office right now?
From open source reporting, that office is shuttered. I checked with a Fusion Center director just this week, and they haven't heard anything from that office, but people may have been shifted around. No one really knows. I guess this type of level of inquiry would probably best left to the Congress to say what's happening with those people, what's happening in the mission. If you don't like the name of the office, change the name. But at the end of the day, Americans value their freedoms and they value their privacy. And that office is specifically designated to prevent fusion centers, the federal government, local state police from spying on you. And it's really important to focus on that.
Some people who are listening to this conversation might see it as being highly partisan. When Democrats have power again, are there going to be concerns that you voice?
When Democrats were in power, I was very, very vociferous about having a secure border, right? It's not an and or thing. You don't have a country unless you have a secure border. If you don't know who's in your country, you don't know what their motives are, you don't know who's trained them, why they're here, you don't have a secure country. Thousands or tens of thousands of migrants coming over every month, it's just not sustainable. There's never any equilibrium between civil rights and civil liberties and protection. So if you look at after 9/11, we wanted to be protected no matter what. And so you saw huge consensus on Congress, bipartisan bills. And then what people find out, the devils are in the details, and that it affects their own privacy and their own civil rights. They want to claw back that. And I think you're going to see that eventually.
Right. I mean, the public does play an incredibly important role in alerting the government to threats, especially terrorist threats. And you've talked about the pendulum swinging before and how Americans are willing to give up some civil liberties when there is the threat of terrorism. And then when the threat diminishes, they want those rights back. So, where is the pendulum swinging today?
See, unlike 9/11, we had a true, actual threat event happen that we can all see with our eyes. And it impacted everyone viscerally, no matter where you were. You didn't have to be in New York City like I was. And so we wanted to do something. I fully believe, and I'm on record saying, that the migrant issue, while is a concern, does not rise to that level. I almost feel that this TDA, the MS-13 threat is so overblown as to create artificially that type of impulse from Americans to allow what's happening to happen now. And so I believe that pendulum will shift because there's no real threat, right? Now, I do want to caveat this, right? Tens of thousands of Americans die every year from opioids. That's clear. What is not clear is that the vast majority of migrants that are coming over are smuggling that. And so let's have a real conversation about what's killing us, what could potentially kill us, and not chase these false narratives.
With the federal leadership changing potentially every 4 years, the directives for the intelligence community can shift. Without that continuity, how does it affect the ability of the intelligence community to address threats?
Well, you're right. It's generally never a problem because there's some continuity at the higher level of these agencies that are able to manage the expectation of POTUS and the National Security Council and hear their concerns while also articulating to them what they're monitoring. And that middle upper management provides that continuity. I think the unique part about what we're experiencing now is that that message isn't being received and it's being dictated from the top down that you will monitor this, as well as eliminating that top level of management within the first months of the administration.
As a last question to you, Donell, do you feel less safe in this country today than you did in previous years?
I do feel less safe. I feel less safe for two reasons. One, because the people that are protecting us have their attention span completely shattered. And two, the alarms, the tripwires that we've put in place after 9/11, I don't believe they're functioning now at a state, local, and federal level because there's no unity of mission.
Donell, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.